Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Safety View, Meet the Author. We've got a great show in line for you today, and I'm going to hand it over to my co-host today, Gary Wong, to kick us off. Take it away, Gary.
Thanks, Tamara. Welcome, everybody, to our session here. I'm really honored and pleased that we have Marion Kiely with us. I've known Marion for a few years now. We've done some work together with Cognitive Edge and look forward to doing more. I'm just going to let Marion say like 2 sentences of where you're from and what do you do? What have you been doing before we kick into the questions?
Right, thanks, Gary. My name, as you were saying, is Marion Kiely. I'm based in Cork in Ireland, very much in the health and safety space with a focus on well-being and trying to prevent work-related stress leading to burnout and suffering along those lines. And a lot of my work basically involves working with stories, and I have come in contact with the Cynefin Framework, and I think that's why I'm here today. I've been invited as I co-authored a chapter in the Cynefin book with Ellie Snowden, and thanks to Tamara and yourselves for the invitation to speak here today on that.
Thank you. I'm screen sharing right now. I get to control some of the slides here. This is the book that Marion's talking about here. It's available on Amazon, by the way. You can buy it in print, or you can actually get it in the Kindle version as well. So let's kind of dive right into it and talk a bit about the chapter that Marion wrote. You begin the chapter, Marion, by stating that executives should not assume that well-being is an individual's problem, so that it's a business challenge that goes beyond productivity. Can I get you to expand on that? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I suppose a lot of the time when we look at health, safety and well-being, we tend to focus on the individual, especially on a well-being front. And we tend to come in and we look at, the slide you have up here looks at stress management interventions. So if we look at well-being and stress, they're like 2 sides of the same coin. So when we want to improve well-being, we try to find out what is it that might be leading to stress. We try and, alleviate some of those stressors in the organization to try with the view of improving well-being. But what we see a lot of, and you'll probably recognize this, is the secondary and the tertiary interventions, but we don't see an awful lot of the primary. And what I tend to liken this to is first aid and plasters and people getting cuts. So really, when we look at health and safety, we go into our hierarchy of controls and we try and prevent the cuts from happening. And that's where your primary is. So when we're looking at well-being here, we want to find out, like, how can we combat work-related stress by looking at how work is organized. So when we look at it, some organizations are good on this front, but many organizations are nearly afraid of going here because they do believe it's the individual and it's very subjective and they don't want to get into that touchy-feely side of things. What we see a lot of is the secondary side of things here, which is the management of stress management interventions, the secondary approach, it looks to combat work-related stress by developing individual skills in stress management through training. And we see a lot out there in relation to training people to recognize elements that might be present by some co-workers whose well-being might be negatively affected, how to recognize that, how to deal with it, managers, how to deal with it as well. So it's really good, the secondary aspects. What that's about putting on the plasters is teaching people how to administer the first aid, is the equivalent of that. And then when we see in the tertiary, that's when actually someone has to go to hospital. There's blood being spilled here and they need some medical attention. And the equivalent of that then is like when somebody is, for example, they might have burnout. It has gone too far. We didn't get in there early enough and the harm has been done. So a lot of the times what we see is that secondary and tertiary, we see a lot of it bandied about. And there's a lot of talk on LinkedIn, there's a lot of talk by many organizations with solutions in this regard, but there's very little actually going in there to try and prevent the cuts. There's a lot of stuff around, sleep hygiene, your diet, your exercise, all really good stuff. But actually, when we look at how is the work negatively, and it's not just negatively, it's positively or negatively impacting the well-being, that's the primary. Where's the good stuff happening? What pockets of the organization is it happening? How can we actually try and amplify that elsewhere and bring that cross-pollinate in the organization? And actually, where is the less than desirable aspect? Where are they happening? How can we actually find them out at an early stage and try and take action to try and prevent, you know, unnecessary harm and suffering coming from that? So when we say it's not just an individual thing, we absolutely are, so, you know, individuals coming into an organization, but when we manage any other aspect of work, be that like chemical hazards or physical hazards or biological hazards, we don't just say, oh, this individual had this reaction. We go in and we try and find out, and so far as we can, and we look at the broader risks associated with these hazards. And when we look at the psychosocial aspects of work, you know, it could be the demand people are under, you know, the workload. It could be something physical in the environment. It could be the relationship, the interpersonal relationships. Is there bullying going on? Are we being told about that? You know what I mean? It could be the role conflict that might be present. It could be the support from leadership or peers. Is that present or isn't it, you know? So it's a different way. We can't just go out and observe and tick a box. We have to actually go out and ask people in relation to their experiences.
Good, thanks for that. I really like the quote in your book from Professor Lika at the Business School at University College Cork in Ireland. How about sharing what she said with the listeners?
Yeah, Professor Leka, she was based in the UK and came to University College Cork, where I lecture as well, there last year. And we included her quote in the chapter. We thought it was so appropriate. So what she says is that even though health, safety and well-being are at the core of workplace and societal functioning and development, the current state of the art indicates that approaches that have been used to promote them have not had the anticipated results. This also applies to mental health in the workplace. A new paradigm is needed to capture the complexity of the modern workplace in relation to mental health. So we just thought that was really powerful, because there's a lot of work being done. There's a lot of people doing really good work out there, but actually when we look at it, you know, we're not having the anticipated results. We're going out there and we're sticking plasters on, and we're taking people to the hospital, but we're not preventing the cuts. We're not going in there. So it's trying to understand that, and there's real complex, it's really complex territory trying to get into that, even when you look at the regulation of that. And why is there a reluctance on the part of regulators to go in and ask these questions and give improvement notices in relation to psychosocial risk assessments, or finding out what it is here, you know, that's ailing people. You know, so
yeah. So what I'm doing, I'm screen sharing your figure 1 in your chapter, because you talk about complexity. So I think that's where the Cynefin Framework helps. Can you tell us how the Cynefin Framework describes this new paradigm that Professor Lika says that we need?
Yeah, and I think, Gary, you do a lot of work in safety, and you have, you know, I would often send my students actually to your website. It's such a huge you know, fountain, like there's a huge resource there, and you have actually populated the Cynefin Framework in relation to safety, and a lot of the tools and the methods that we use are over here on the right hand side. But when we look at well-being and mental health, it's actually over here as well. We're looking on the right hand side here for people. Are people familiar with the Cynefin Framework actually?
Why don't you spend, give it a quick tour, 1 minute, just around there, just go through the different domains?
Yeah, if you look on the right hand side here, okay, there are 2 domains here. You have the clear and complicated. Basically here what we can see is that there is clear cause and effect relationships. Down in the clear, we're all in agreement here. You know, it's obvious to us what the cause and effect is. We can move up to the complicated. There is a cause and effect relationship, but we might actually have to call in some expert. If I want to get my car serviced, for example, it's very obvious to the mechanic, but to me it's not. So we just call someone in who can actually look at this. But then when we go over to the left-hand side here of the framework, what we're looking at here is actually, this is the unordered space. And this is where cause and effect relationships, they're not immediately obvious to us. It's only in hindsight that we will see these cause and effect relationships. So a lot of the times, what we tend to do is we tend to look at every issue that we have as something that's maybe complicated or it's clear. And in that complicated space, that's the domain of the experts. And this is where you actually bring in people who are the experts. And when in relation to well-being, you know, we bring in these experts to try and solve a problem, like there is a clear cause and effect relationship. But actually, well-being is quite complex. And you act in a different way when you come over here to the complex domain. So actually bringing in this expertise without actually finding out what really is you know, where are we at here in relation to what are the psychosocial aspects of work that are positively or negatively influencing our employees? Somebody from external cannot tell us that. If they have worked down the road in another plant, in another company, and they have this recipe for well-being, it might well work when you're trying to come up with solutions in relation to a certain aspect that is leading to stressors in the organization. But you don't know if that's actually present here or not yet because you haven't asked the question. So we want to go over here, we want to find out and ask those questions in such a way that we're really getting good, rich data. And I'm sure you've spoken before about psychological safety. This is actually about trying to find out what is it that's happening. And we have populated the Cynefin Framework, actually, this is in our chapter as well. And we have outlined in that some of the well-being approaches. And what I didn't mention previously is you'll see the little curve here at the bottom between clear and chaotic. And if you could imagine that in a 3D, the clear is up at a really, really high space here. It's like a top of a cliff. And if you fall over here, you can go well down into, you can end up in chaos. Now, I'm an advocate of mindfulness. I practice mindfulness meditations. I was on a course there recently. I've done my master's on mindfulness interventions. I'm a big believer in it. But the reason we have it down here in the clear domain is that it's not for everybody. And it's not to be seen as a solution that can be put out there that will fix people. If people have a certain problem, we'll send them for mindfulness training. And if they don't come back and their stress isn't down, that it's their problem. We need to be very, very careful that we don't put some employee who's under a bit of feeling the pressure to make them feel that they're a bigger problem and that, do you know what I mean? And to actually make their stress worse, because they can actually end up going into that chaos place saying, what's wrong with me? Other people in the organization or in my workplace, they've tried this mindfulness stuff, they're all flying it. I can't, it's not working for me. Some people don't want to go into that place. Their lived experience is such, they don't want to go in there. They really don't want to be present and bring some of that stuff that has been buried from the past forward. So it's just being mindful of mindfulness, I suppose, for want of a better expression. It is very good, but it's not a one size fits all. You know, we have down here as well, when we look at physical and mental health promotion, down here we often see like gym membership subsidies, sleep hygiene, yoga and yogurt, we'll call it, you know, cycle to work scheme. They're all really good, but they're down here, you know, in an ordered space, but we can't see if they're actually going to fix some problem. They will definitely help improve, but there are other aspects as well. We go up here in the complicated domain, and up here we have a lot of, we might have our work-related stress risk assessment. And this is like, again, when some expert comes in who would have some system here for doing this risk assessment. It could be an occupational health physician or advisor. You might have peer support programs, employee assistance programs. These are expert led. They're very, very good. I have availed of these services myself. They're absolutely brilliant, but they do belong in the complicated domain. And you can have surveys here as well. And a lot of the times we see this in relation to well-being. A survey is issued and we look at this quantitative data then to see where we're at. But a lot of the times the context is missing. You know, it's not present in those surveys. So when we go over to the complex domain, then what we see here, and sometimes we'll see change systems such as performance management, career progression, reward and recognition systems. These actually, they can go between the complex and the complicated domain. You know, we're trying to see here which ones of these are positively or negatively impacting the well-being. But when we come down to SenseMaker then, which is a software designed by Cognitive Edge, this actually works with stories, and there is no right or wrong way to do this. And you've probably experienced this yourselves when you look at surveys that are issued out, depending on the form at the time. And I have worked in some organizations where it was a bit of a bartering tool. And if the lads were looking for something to be got, it was good actually before the employee engagement survey came out to start bartering. And then there'd be nobody actually filling in the survey. And then there was a fear that everybody was just going to put in zeros or ones or twos instead of the tens, you know. So it was a good time actually for unions and stuff to. So sometimes you can get the data in the surveys getting played depending on the organization. Whereas with working with stories, there is no playing really. It's just saying this is an experience I'm sharing, and I'm attaching some, you know, sense making to that. This is what my experience means to me. So there is no playing it as such. But what you can get out of that is you can get quantitative data, you can really see the patterns that are here, and you can break it down via demographics, via, various plants, geographical locations between various functions in the organization. And you can contrast and compare, and you can see, shift A are doing really well, shift B, actually, there's a real issue here in relation to something we didn't even realize that was present. So that can help with that. And what we've done here then on the line between complex and chaotic here is working with stories. And this really is kind of some workshops, and I have done a lot of these in the past in relation to looking at safe to fail experiments. Anecdote circles is one of the methods, and sense making workshops I've been there.
So most of you professionals that are on the line, you've been dealing with a lot of data, ranging from pen and paper checklists to make keyboard entries in sophisticated safety software programs. That's good and well. In fact, the idea of the Cynefin Framework is that everything you see there is fine and it works well within that domain. And we call that bounded applicability. But what you don't want to do is actually kind of do those traditional surveys when they're actually in the complex domain here. That's what Marion is trying to explain here. So we know the term is big data, and that big data captures the who, the when, the where, and the what aspects here. What Marion is talking about is the whole concept of stories and why stories are so powerful. Marion, can you just tell us a bit about homo narrans and why they are so powerful?
Yeah, and I suppose, look, Gary, you came over last year to the Aran Islands, and we had a Cynefin retreat where Dave was present and some of the others in Cognitive Edge, and we looked at how stories shape our societies and our organizations. And I think this year that has been played out on a scale that we probably couldn't have perceived prior to that. And if you just look at stories and narrative around elections and how that shapes people, when we look at even Brexit and stuff, the stories really hold a lot of weight. We can present a lot of data and numbers to people, but actually the meaning can really be derived much more from a story. Now, what we're interested in when we're talking about stories and we're talking about sense maker, we're much more interested in the patterns from multiple stories. And then we can go in and say, I'm really curious about this pattern that's developing here. And we can go in and we can actually get the context, and we can read those stories, and we can find out information that we previously were not aware of. Because there's blind spots in organizations the whole time. And what these stories do, they're basically employees holding up mirrors so we can see around these corners and see nuggets of information that we just weren't aware of before. So these stories, and I think, I imagine, Tamara, a lot of people here on this call are like health and safety professionals. You would have a lot of health and safety people who will come in with a really good program that they want to roll out in an organization. But if the story is, and if the narrative in that organization is, they actually don't care. We've reported stuff loads of times before. They didn't listen. That story, that narrative has much more sway over people, whether they will actually engage, no matter how good the program is. If that narrative is there, it is a barrier, and that really influences our behaviors and how much we will engage or how much we will disengage with something. They have huge weight in our making sense. And we can go on about stories, and I can share so many stories here, from an organization level, but actually from like even a national level that has just changed actually. And even the title of the book, The Fabric of Our Organization, like the fabric of our nation here in Ireland has been shifted by stories.
Yeah. So far as a bit of a summary, what Marion is talking about is kind of like from the theory side of how we can make change. But a lot of you on here are practitioners. So what we're interested in is how do you take the theory and actually use that within the workplace here? So in the chapter here, Marion has a really good practical method how to collect stories using anecdote circles. So I'm going to ask Marion to explain quickly what an anecdotal circle is, what are the benefits, and maybe some of the do's and don'ts about anecdote circles.
I have a question before that.
Sure, go ahead.
Marion, do you think that an internal person can get these stories versus an external person because of the psychological safety of being able to tell the truth? I
do, Rosa, and in my experience, it's down to, you'll know yourself, right? There's some people who are genuine and active listeners, and you have others who are in it. They don't have skin in the game. You know what I mean? They're in it for their own, like, and this is not so much, I've been there in the past, and I have actually put my own role on the line because I wouldn't reveal, because of an anonymous system, who has said what and who reported what. That integrity has to be there. But I do believe, and I'm sure in your experience, you have been told stories in the past, you know, and these are ones that aren't actually said in the meetings. And you can go into meetings and there can be, you know, really good stuff presented, and people are nodding in silence. And then you come out the door, and that's when the real discussion starts. Not actually in front of management, sometimes inside in these meetings, you know.
Yeah.
But I do believe sometimes, it's bad when it's down to just an individual as well. You know, if a whole program is dependent on one individual, what happens when that individual is out? Is that trust gone? Is everything gone now? So we need to try and make sure that it's not just down to somebody being a good listener. Collecting these stories, I think a lot of it is around how it's communicated, as in the reason why we want to collect these stories. And actually, when you look at it on a big scale, you have Sense Maker. This is actually collecting stories across the organization, across the country, depending on what context. And then you have workshops where you're collecting on a smaller scale.
Mhm.
How you communicate why you're actually collecting these stories, and how it's going to help the decision makers to actually bring about real impact in the organization. If that's done and you have a good steering group working with you who can convey and communicate this quite clearly, that's really helpful. If you're looking at a workshop whereby you have a facilitator, it's good actually to have two facilitators in that. But again, it's not your job as a facilitator to influence those stories. It's not your job to even to give one example. And this comes back to what Gary is asking me. You are there to bring these people together so they can learn from each other. They can share their knowledge without realizing it. Because within these stories, in our experience in work, we think other people know what we know. And it's just obvious to us. So we don't actually even talk about it. But by actually telling stories, we share information that we don't realize that others don't know. And they pick that up via the stories. And I can even bring this back to, I was visiting, I was in Kansas there last year, and I was staying with a friend, and it came up in conversation, something about Trump, I'll be honest, and I know this is very topical this year in the States with the elections. And just from my perspective, I suppose, being somebody in Ireland, and I'm not making this political, but I wouldn't be a big Trump fan, you know, and I was just wondering, I couldn't believe why people would actually vote that way. And this guy told me a story, and in his experience, why he changed from being a Democrat to voting Republican. And the way he told that story, I understood, I got it. In that context, I got it, and I was like, that makes absolute sense to me. Whereas if we talk of this polarized side of things, the stories help us to get the context, to make sense of that situation as to why people would do what they do. And once you know that information, now we have a chance of actually doing something together and going forward with this new, you know, insights that we have gained from each other. Whereas if we're just going to be at loggerheads here, like, and I'm seeing a 6 and you're seeing a 9, and there's no way one of us is going to go around the side to even try and see why the other one sees it that way, then we don't go, you know. But just as a facilitator, your job is to actually enable others to share their stories. It's not to influence in any way, shape or form. And I have to give a shout out on this to Ron Donaldson, actually, who would have been my mentor when I got going. Dave suggested I reach out to Ron, who's his Ecology of Knowledge is Ron's website, but he's real master at anecdote circles, and it's brilliant. I've seen some stories shared in workshops whereby I've gotten goosebumps just by being an observer and seeing people present stories, and I've seen people cry with laughter as well. They're just a great way of actually breaking barriers, you know.
Just on that topic here, one of the things I've actually discovered, there's a big difference between being a consultant, which is typically over in the complicated and kind of clear domain, and actually being a complex facilitator. So as a complex facilitator, as I've noted in the chat from Sandra and Tanya, I am not a therapist. I'm not a trained psychologist. I don't go there because I'm not trying to look and influence the content. The content is owned by the storytellers, and it's up to them to do it here. If I'm a so-called facilitator, I'm looking after the process and the context and kind of saying that. So even in a session, when people come up to you and ask you, what should we do next, Gary? What should we do this, Marion? Our answer is, I don't know. Why don't you go talk to somebody else and find out? You know, it sounds like a lame answer, but it's very powerful because they go, oh, turn around, and they find their own answer within their own context, within their own group there. It takes a lot of practice because you as a consultant, you want to get in there, you know, because you got a timeline to meet and you got things to get done. You just got to hold that and don't go there.
And it's a
Just let the
challenge. You're absolutely
conversation flow.
right. Yeah, it is a challenge because, look, people are coming to us with a problem. They want us to come in and fix it. And we're human beings, so we want to help other people, we want to fix it. But actually, we have to get comfortable with saying, we don't know here. We just have to go in and let your folks at it and just let them try and make sense of this and come up with their own, you know, small actions that they believe will have a big impact here in this organization. And it's just by getting those multiple perspectives. And you can see some really rich output coming out of that, like, you know, with some safe to fail experiments and stuff. And that's really powerful as well, when you can see people making sense of, because at a certain level in the organization, if I'm an operator, which I was for a lot of my time in my previous role, we'll say in Pfizer, I see the organization from my perspective. Now, my supervisor has another layer. He sees other things from his perspective that I'm actually blinded to. His manager sees more another side of things. And actually, you have the senior leaders and directors and stuff. And actually, between all those layers, if we can come together and actually talk about some issue that's coming up in such a way, you know, and share our knowledge in a way, you know, that is safe to do so, the insights that we can glean from that can be really helpful in understanding, that's why that won't work. So there's no point in actually putting forward this because I didn't realize there was a budget cap on that if it goes over a certain amount. So if we keep it, okay, right, that makes sense. And it's just by gaining these little nuggets that we can kind of come together and say, right, let's try it. Have we thought about how this might fail? And if it did, how might we pull the plug on it? Have we thought about how it might look like if it succeeded? And if it did, is there anywhere else in the organization we believe would benefit from that we could actually, you know, try and cross-pollinate it there across the organization and see if it can take shoot elsewhere? But it's by these small actions that we'll see that change. Because a lot of the time, and you've mentioned there about consultants coming in, they're selling solutions, they're selling recipes that will have worked for in a company down the road, and they're bringing in the same set of recipes,
right.
You know, thinking that this will actually fix the problems here, but they haven't actually asked the questions. And a lot of the times the expertise is inside your own organization. And when we look at it, I think it's the last time I checked, is it 75% of these change programs fail?
Yeah.
You know, when they actually,
yeah,
it's around that, like, so it's like when we come in with these big change programs, we have to be really aware of the Hawthorne effect. And when we have pilot programs, you know, management are so keen, or the leadership are so keen for this to actually be a success through no fault of their own. We all have our biases and things that we're not even aware of, because they're saying, like, we really need this to work and we're investing a lot of money. People will tell you what they think you want to hear, you know. So even though something mightn't be working optimally, we will actually, we'll cut bits off this to make it fit because this is what's wanted, you know. And for a certain amount of time, just like you do with the Hawthorne effect, with turning up the lights and turning down the lights, productivity will increase, you know. But it's actually when you go away, what's it like in 6 months' time or 12 months' time? And then we see actually it's not what we thought it was. But by doing these small actions locally and actually having a real ripple effect, you can get a real resonance, you can get a vibration across the organization, and that can shift over. It does take time, but you can see that actually happening. And that really changes the ecosystem more so than a big, we're taking off this plaster, we're putting on this one. It's like our small little actions. Yeah.
Marion, as a person who's collected stories for over 30 years, as you are describing, I find there's another, what shall we call it, hazard in this process, which is that when you go into an organization and you start collecting the stories, people begin to feel a sense of hope that something is going to get better or something is going to change. And then nothing does. Because I have delivered these stories to some managers, and or executives, and they're moved by them, and others are completely unmoved by the information. And as we know, the safety professional isn't the one with the power and resources to actually make the changes in the organization. So I'm wondering how you manage that, how you go in, is that something that you think about, the level of commitment of the management group? Or
Yeah, and I've been there and I've done that, Rosa, and I've similar experience whereby you go in, and I have presented to the senior leadership team saying, guys, I'm presenting here, and it's a bit of a gamble because people are looking for, where has this worked before, and you're saying, look, it's kind of a new approach in your context, but it's worked across the globe and there's plenty of applications of it, but they are taking a bit of a leap of faith. But the one thing I would say is, before you go down this road, be mindful, we're going to give hope. If you are not willing as leaders to follow through on the actions and some of the suggestions that come out of this, you will probably end up worse off than where you are. Because now there's a bigger chance you're going to have some learned helplessness where people are going to be more disillusioned than what they were previously. So it's trying to instill, and I've learned the hard way on that. Now I try and do a piece first with the leadership team, trying to pique their curiosity to say we can bury our heads in the sand and we can pretend that life is the way we want to see it, or we can actually take our heads up and try and see where actually are we? What is the reality in this organization? How do people feel? How do they see it and perceive it? What options are there for us? And if they want to be a stick in the mud and be this robust, old, this is the way we're going to ride this one out, so be it. But you run the risk of just catastrophic results if you're not willing to actually put those feelers out there to those potential weak signals, and some of them actually aren't all that weak, and take that on board to help you become more resilient and give you that competitive edge, really. But I think what the problem can be actually, if you're dealing with the public sector in particular, that competition isn't there, and there can be a lot of bureaucracy, and there can be a lot of people there for years. And in some places, it's not so much that I come back and tell the stories. In the workshops that we do, is we facilitate people telling stories themselves amongst each other, and actually having that resonance, and going around and seeing what the reality is from other people's stories. But it's just, they do come up with some safe to fail experiments, and if the support isn't there from the leadership teams and managers to actually follow through on that, that's a real missed opportunity
as well. I see Tanya nodding her head a lot. Tanya, what are you thinking? You're muted. There you go.
Well, I think everything that Marion is saying is absolutely true. The Alvison and Spicer wrote a book on functional stupidity, which, they had concluded, and they're not the only authors, there are lots of other books that talk about how dysfunctional our workplaces are, but it's real. It's absolutely real. And people who stand up to the dysfunction in their workplace don't necessarily get what they think they will from such an experience. So, it's absolutely real. So, I have heard so many people echo what Marion had said, that, the leadership don't know. Like there was a podcast that I listened to recently where there's corruption in some companies in Norway. And so they, the leaders are now in high level trial type situations. And so they start talking about, so how is the culture, at your company? And they say, well, it's good. And these researchers were saying, how do you know? How can you even answer a question like that? How can you even have the words to express that you have any information on that? You're just making it up. If you're not actually actively trying to get these stories and trying to understand work is done and trying to understand more about your own company, you should refuse to answer a question like that because you honestly don't know.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, actually. Sonia, who's another colleague of ours in Cognitive Edge, she ran a very interesting SenseMaker project in South Africa. And at the same time, they issued out their traditional employee engagement survey. So SenseMaker was issued out in relation to safety, and they had the employee survey as well. Actually, like the employee survey showed everything was hunky-dory, you know, all rosy in the garden, no problems. SenseMaker then, oh, hang on a second, this is a very different picture. So what we're seeing here, if we are coming from a place of genuine curiosity, there's a whole lot there to learn, but it is down to know, do we really want to know? Do our leaders want to know? Or is it all about getting this machine, this organization, as lean as we can, so close to the bone actually that there's going to be some blood spilt, but we're happy with that? Or do we really want to know and make this a very resilient organization that can adapt and change as it goes, depending on what comes at it, you know?
And it would be
Yeah.
great if other members have questions to or thoughts to share in. Lisa,
Yeah, I was just, yeah, thanks, Tamara. I was just going to respond to Marion, and I agree that managers may not know, and hearing from employees is critical. I am going to be a little bit provocative and say that many manager leaders, or if they're leaders, don't want to know. And I think we have a very hard road ahead of us in helping the current managers, the incumbents, understand their own fear of losing power. I think that is going to be critical to the success of Cynefin in helping organizations move forward. And I trust you're getting there. In fact, let me ask that question. Are you finding that there is sometimes resistance to hearing the stories and moving in that direction?
That's the next book, Lisa.
Great.
I could write a whole book on that, like, you know, and there's a whole psychology.
So let me respond to that, is that we often talk about finding and discovering patterns that kind of tell us people behave. What we're finding out, Lisa, is that there are anti-patterns. What are anti-patterns? Things are like that here. We'd like to know what's going on, but we really don't want to know what's going on because I'm going to lose power. So
That's
I think
right.
a whole extra piece of research we want to do in here is kind of look for those anti-patterns here and find out, not us as consultants, but find out if the people are willing to kind of raise these anti-patterns and reveal them to management. Sometimes I use the term black elephants. We know it's like an elephant in the room here and it's black like a black swan. Is it time for the company to raise and reveal the black elephants? Then what are you going to want to do about it?
That's right. I'm
And
glad
I
you
think,
go ahead. Sorry, Marion.
no, I think regardless that you were always going to have some people. I had one there a couple of years back where it's like kids with their blankies, you know, they have this with them since the year dot, and they love the feel they get from this blankie. So it's this system that they have nourished and polished and looked after for all these years, and now somebody's coming in potentially saying we need to do something different, and come hell or high water, like this blankie is, you know what I mean? So it's that attachment piece, and just being really mindful of the psychology behind that. And there will always be resistance. There will, you know, in my experience.
What I find frustrating, because the gap that exists between the words that come from these leaders' mouths of, we so want the engagement, we want empowerment. And yet what you've just said, Marion, and you also alluded to, Gary, the recognition of their own loss of power in honoring those words is huge. And how do you build the awareness?
That's what comes out of the stories. A lot
Yeah.
of the times we talk about values. What are our values and what's up on the walls here? What I'm really interested in and what comes out of the stories are the norms. You will not find them written down anywhere. You know, and if you try and find them somewhere inside in a control room or inside in a conference room, you will not see these norms. But if you go and you like have stories and have the lads out on the floor talking, you will find out the do's and the don'ts. You just don't do that, you know, and you will find out very soon. But we don't give that too much information, but they do come out within those stories in relation to, even if they're not spelt out, when we actually go back and look at them and some of the patterns and some of the clusters, and we're saying, trying to make sense of this here. Like, I've been in some organizations where like people have actually stood around a table looking at this story, and there's like, oh, and the rape allegations. It's like, I'm looking going, the what? And like, they're all nodding. It's like, oh my God, this is actually in this organization. So there can be dark stuff there that resonates with people, you know what I mean? But actually, we just need to, that stuff will just trickle out in the stories, whereas you will not get that on your check sheet and your 35 questions on a Likert scale of 1 to 10, good, bad, or indifferent, and how I feel. You will not get that context, whereas in the stories, that stuff just, it falls out, you know, and there can be a real understanding there as to what it really is like for people. And sometimes leadership need to hear that. I have been in workshops whereby the leadership team who had gone through a merger, they were going around and they couldn't believe that people were fearful. They were describing the organization as dark. There was mistrust, there was uncertainty, and they were like, but we have communicated this time. But when they went to the fourth table, they were like, oh my God, we have a big problem here. We haven't communicated this well. This is what our people feel. They actually, I could come in and tell them that. Going back to your point, Rosa, it doesn't matter what I say, but it's actually when they hear it themselves and those layers, that disintermediation piece is taken out, and they make sense of it themselves because the people are there in front of them. That's what can actually help for them to see, this is actually where things are. This is where we're at. And it can be a challenge because a lot of the times you have a health and safety manager or director, but they don't have the power in the organization really to influence, because we talk, and Rosa, you've done huge research here in relation to safety culture, and actually it's the organization culture. It's not just, but you have somebody here who's very passionate about safety and wants to improve the safety side of things, but it's the whole organization has to shift here to enable that. The artifacts that we use every day, how are our bonuses? How do they influence how our managers actually, you know, behave, if you want to look at that whole behavior piece, like, you know, on a day-to-day basis, you know, what are the rules? What are the things that we're focusing on? Are we going back to our zero? Are we looking at, we don't want a certain type of injury, so that's where all the stuff is going. So when we look at health and safety, we're here supposed to be trying to protect people and prevent these injuries and suffering from happening, but actually we're taking people to the doctor when they need help and we're telling him not to give them, you know, prescribed medication because that's going to reflect badly on us. What are we actually doing? And when we stand back, but it's a numbers game, and that's what safety has become in a lot of organizations, not in all of them, you know, and that's where the well-being overlaps as well. Sorry.
Yes. You know, Marion, when we first, Tamara, Lisa, and I first began to gather together you guys as thought leaders, we had a vision of collaborating together to bring thinking to the next level. So it wasn't just, you know, well, we want to learn from you because that is your area of expertise. But I'm wondering if we could take it to another level just for a moment, because I have been thinking about this a long time, ever since I read Carl Week's example of the doctors who did not recognize child abuse in the emergency room. But when a social worker came in, she recognized it immediately. So the difference is how you're educated and trained, right? We each have a focus, and obviously management is focused on financials and marketing. I mean, I've been through the MBA program. I know what the MBA program consists of, and it certainly doesn't consist of understanding the human systems. So what would happen if we just acknowledge that and brought in people with that expertise, you know, the psychology, the social work. And we said, hey, you know, you guys, this is your bailiwick, because we really do need to have this part of the organization be healthy.
Absolutely. Yeah, and
I'd also like to have a chance for some of the other members who have been a little bit more quiet. Sandra and Tanya, I've seen you guys having some discussion in the chat that would be really great to share with Marion.
Cool. Can I just come back to Rosa on that one point before we move on? Ed Corbett, who's with the HSE in the UK, has mentioned that several times.
Oh, yeah.
Ed Corbett, worth connecting with Ed, fierce nice guy, connect with him on LinkedIn. But he's saying, why are these MBAs, why is there not a piece in there on the value of health and safety? You know what I mean? And how if we go a different way about things, how we can really help with those numbers. if this is what we're interested in, and we're interested in shareholder value and the financials, it can be a real help. And if you look at the project that was done in Merseycare, the NHS in the UK, and their restorative just culture and learning program, they saved, I don't know, I think conservatively they said £1.8 million per year, but I think it was closer to double that. So if you can show these leaders, actually, this isn't just fluffy bunny stuff where your people are going to be happy clappy, but it's going to cost you a fortune. If you can show, actually, it makes good business sense, you're well protected legally, you know what I mean? You really have consulted here and you're taking action on the real issues, and your people feel valued and respected, and there's huge inclusion here, like in the decision making and how we evolve this organization. Now you're talking, now you're going to actually catch their attention. So I think we need more examples like that. And actually, if you're talking to the universities saying, how can we include some of this in those modules that these MBAs are delivering as well, that it's not seen. And I can see why. And if you look at the whole deregulation piece around health and safety, and you actually had David Cameron in the UK going back there in the last, whenever he was in power, saying that he was going to get rid of this albatross health and safety around the neck of businesses, you know, that we were seeing as just dead weight. A lot of health and safety is really good stuff. You know what I mean? There's really good things happening. Some of it is just bureaucracy and has been taken too far. And I think we need to kind of get a Marie Kondo really, you know, to declutter a lot of our health and safety, to keep the good, what brings us joy, and try and maybe start looking at what is some of the stuff that's just dead weight. We're doing it because we've always done it, but it's not actually delivering. You know, it's not improving the health and safety. Sorry, no,
Sandra.
I agree.
Yeah, listen, Sandra, got some comments you want to share?
Oh, Marion, it's always great to hear from you, and I'm always learning from you, and can't wait to learn more. I've ordered my copy of the book, so I look forward to that to read over the Thanksgiving holiday. I mean, just so much of your experience resonates with me. I've always struggled a little bit with some of our with employee surveys sometimes, because they sort of give maybe on a good day, you know, they're giving some sort of direction or a sense of like, this isn't going the way we want, or maybe it is, but the way it's designed, you can't get any really depth or context. So even if I want to keep doing something well, or I want to fix something that's not going well, I don't have enough information to know what that might be. So I've, you know, I didn't call it story collecting or anything like that, or anecdote circles. I have some training in appreciative inquiry, and I kind of mix some of those methods with some other methods to get some of the, you know, more difficult bits out too. But it's only then that kind of, I was really able to help people understand, if you want to make improvements, and if you want to understand why this is going whatever direction it is, good or bad, you know, this, you need to go further than these, you know, Likert scale surveys can do for you. And to Rose's point, I always, I tend to joke quite a bit about that engineers would never ask you know, a psychologist or a sociologist to come in and help them design a facility or drill a well. But we often see that people feel very confident in trying to solve social human systems problems without the expertise of people from social sciences or psychology or sociology or whatever it might be. And it just kind of, it's like, phone a friend, call an expert. I mean, it's okay to say, this is not my domain of expertise, and you know, I should look elsewhere for solutions. So it just all really resonates with me.
And I think that overlaps with what Lisa was saying earlier on as well. And that's the shift that needs to happen in leadership. Years ago, it was okay to be up in the corner office and to be the one with all the knowledge and to be able to make those decisions. Now our world is changing at such a rate where we've information overload, and our systems and technology, the whole lot is changing so quickly. We need to tap into the experience that's in our department, in our team, you know. And so to actually say, I don't actually know the best way to go about this, can actually be seen as inspirational, because you're actually empowering your people rather than actually seeing that as a flaw in yourself, you know. And I think that's a shift that it's getting more and more accepted, but it's definitely.
Yeah, I love the solutions focused approach where you really try to draw out from people what works versus telling them what works. And I really appreciate all that nuance you mentioned earlier too about maybe this worked here, but you don't just go and sell it there, because it doesn't, a big, large scale interventions don't just transfer across context seamlessly.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
And we do have member Jim who would also like to share a thought.
My experience is that a really good way to get integrated into the conversation and operations is to go out with paired observations, working with the line managers in the field and helping them structure the interactions they have with their people such that they're listening more, telling less, prescribing much less, and having those real conversations such that the people in the field are actually able to influence the organizational dynamics, the processes and procedures in ways that help them do their job better. And I don't think we spend nearly enough time with that.
And it does mean a lot, Jim. I agree with you. I've seen that in the past whereby our site lead, the most senior person in our site, would come down and go out and actually spend some time with the lads. And he'd come back saying, I'm not happy with how that job has been done. I wouldn't like to be in their shoes. I want to see some change brought about there. What supports do they need? He'll chat with them, and that goes a long way in building up the trust as well in the system. Now these are all small things and they definitely help. There's no doubting that. And sometimes, depending on the individuals, again, there could be shyness and they mightn't be as open as what they might be, because of this person and the power gradient, I suppose, for want of a better expression, that they might be disinclined to open up. But some people will be, and it's down to the leader themselves as well, but definitely more of that human touch and seeing the people behind the title and to show that you value and respect these contributions, that all helps, But yeah.
In
we have a call. Go ahead, Jim.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Finish off.
I was just saying, inverting the percentage of time, so many senior leaders and a lot of mid-level and even lower level leaders are in the field spending 70–80% of their time evaluating performance and providing feedback and tracking and those types of things. And they don't save any time for actually listening and understanding. In my experience, most leaders have very little understanding of how work's actually done.
And it's very hard, to make that prescriptive though, isn't it? Because you will have one leader who will be absolutely brilliant and he will enjoy that and there'll be really great rapport and you'll build trust, and you'll have somebody else who'll come out and they're just awkward socially. They just don't enjoy it. You can tell they don't enjoy it. The lads don't enjoy him calling down. And eventually it just dilutes. It becomes this negative thing. The context is so important in all of this. It would be lovely to think that we could make all these great leaders that go and talk to everybody and listen. But the reality is quite different,
We have to teach them.
Yeah.
And, there's some expertise out there in how we go about that.
Okay.
Yeah. I just want to say we have a colleague on the line, Greg Spencer. Greg's done a lot of work in Cynefin as well, and you can see by his photo in the area of paddling. Greg, just any comments and thoughts about well-being that maybe struck you? Greg, you still there? You're unmuted. You're still muted.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm struggling slightly to recognize where local ownership can take place. And that, I think, is the next emerging field. We've had safety 1, we've had safety 2, and we've got the big patterns coming out in the stories. But at the moment, a lot of the recognition of patterns in the big stories seems to be coming at quite a high level. And I'm really interested to hear how that is happening at a local scale.
Okay, I'm trying to make sense of the question, Greg. As in the The people reading the patterns you think are coming from a senior level.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, actually, yeah, in the workshops that the ones I have undertaken, you actually have frontline employees that you would have a mix at it, like, and depending on which of the methods you are using, sometimes you will actually intentionally have people who work together, sit together for some of them, and other ones then you will actually mix that up. But it's obviously your decision makers are senior, and it does have to, whatever actions that fall out has to go with them. But there definitely is a resonance and making sense of those stories amongst all people who would be involved, not just senior. You would have frontline there as well. And yeah.
And as we get down to smaller scale, there's a phase shift. We're looking at very, very small groups of people. The connectivity between the senior and every other level is different. And I see a lag. I mean, a lot of the work that's being done at the cutting edge is at very large organizations. And there's definitely a large gap when we get down to your small scale.
Yeah, definitely. And as well, I suppose when you're talking about safety 1 and safety 2, I definitely think, in my experience, the engagement piece, I suppose, if you're looking at just the adaptive safety piece and that whole consultation piece, it's really important with your frontline. But frontline alone can't bring about that change. I have seen people who have been they have bought into programs, they have been big advocates, they have, they've ended up with a learned helplessness because of the lack of support that has come from leadership. So that leadership piece is really important in getting that support, making sure their video is aligned with their audio. But sometimes, because of the political landscape in that organization, for whatever reasons, and they're very hard to call out, there is a resistance there. And yeah, I don't have the answers to that. I'm not, like, every organization is different, but I have seen that play out and people getting hurt because of that. And you just need to look at it. Tanya mentioned there earlier on about people who stand up. You look at any whistleblower out there. In hindsight, they might be cheered on as the champions, but actually, what support did they get while they were going through that? When life was like hell, more often than not, the odds are stacked against them, So it's not an easy one to figure out psychology-wise. It's messy. We all have a standard we think would be nice, but actually in reality it plays out quite differently, and people can be quite just manipulative and unaccepting of each other and any threat to their status in their position where they are, and they'll do anything to fight that. So
yeah, I know we're coming to the end of our time, but I did want to also, just ask any members who haven't had a chance to say anything yet. I know some have been a little bit quieter than others, and I just wanted to give you an opportunity. Do you have anything that you want to share or ask Marion before we go?
I just want to make an observation that Greg, please tell me you have a glass of sherry with you. You just look
very relaxed.
Like that would be the perfect thing.
It's still a little early at the moment, but give it a few minutes.
The setup is fabulous.
But I do think the really interesting question to come on to is how we have a whole history of lag where smaller organizations look to the bigger organizations for the example and feel they have to copy and follow. And the danger I'm seeing with all of this is we come up with a whole load of approaches which are absolutely spot on for our large organizations. And then we see actual problems being introduced into safety cultures and well-being cultures in smaller organizations because people try to adapt or adopt solutions out of context and not understanding the scaling issue, especially when you get to organizations of fewer than 40, 50 people where everybody genuinely does know one another. And trying to do this same approach does not make a lot of sense. Now, that's not to say that they should carry on doing what they are at the moment,
Yeah.
but the answer is not to start where somebody else is.
And it's actually interesting, Greg. I had one client and there's 8 employees in their business, you know, and I had gone in doing some, they didn't, their health and safety side of things, they just wanted to do some work on that. So I was looking at their safety statement, the document where you look at their policies and stuff, but there was a huge consultation piece there, very transparent, with the team of 8. This is what we're proposing. Have you any input to that, you know? But actually after a year they came back and it was like, there's huge mistrust between management here and the team. So actually Ron Donaldson that I mentioned earlier in the UK came over and we actually had a workshop with 8 people, and you'd say, how could you have? We had it with 8 people. There was animosity. We were like taken aside by some of the team members saying, can we please do this like on 2 separate days? I was like, please trust the process. Just go with it. Just see what comes out of it, you know. We're doing this various methods like future backwards, anecdote circles, whatever. So we done it. The difference at lunchtime, even with people looking each other in the eye with actual empathy because of stories that were shared and stuff. And this isn't now, and I don't mean to come in like you're going to wave this magic wand and we're all going to be singing Kumbaya and telling stories. But it's an example whereby you did have a small group and actually it did bring about, because it wasn't a recipe, because it was us as facilitators, here are the methods, you tell your story, you share your stories, you look at where you want to go with this. And what ended up happening is you actually had the team members challenging each other softly in the safe environment, because now we had created the context for them to do that and there was no judgment and it was safe enough to do so, you know. So, and you don't make those statements lightly. It's not like I'm going to come in, as I say, like a fairy godmother and sprinkle this dust and everyone is going to be smiling. That's not the case, but it did work for a smaller organization in this instance without adopting all the bells and whistles that you might get from adapting those larger organizations.
Yeah, the
Now,
narrative level, the story level will always work. It's the systems which are very abstract and the rest of it that can be very different. But it's almost just starting from a family type scale. And, you know, we've got, you know, would this work in a family setting? I mean, Dave's example of a children's party, it's thinking through the tools at that scale is something that we sometimes forget.
And you're spot on, because so much of our industry is actually those size organizations. We focus on the big ones, but they're actually a very small percentage of, you know, the companies out there at large. So it's definitely worthy to look at that.
Now, I know that we're just over our time, but Fred, I did see you on mic. So did you have something that you wanted to share?
My thoughts are that it's a very, very complex area. And I think that businesses don't want to take on the challenge of curing society of all the ills that human interactions create in society. And so I think there's a careful balancing act between how much interaction and honesty within the organization creates benefit for the organization against, we don't want to open up other wounds and create more conflict and challenges for the organization. So I think it's kind of a very careful balancing act. And then another element of that allows more focus on, there's been studies done with a colleague of mine in Canada that nearly 50% of managerial time is wasted time. And so if some of the organizational structures and operations that contribute to the waste of time could be eliminated, that would give time for managers to do more managerial work and get to know their teams better, and to actually pursue some of this without taking extra time away from what's normal work.
Yeah, for sure. And I think as well, there's actually there's a really positive impact that the organization can have on society by how the employees actually are treated. Because a lot of the times we look at health and safety, that's how we think about how people can get hurt at work. Actually, I see it that people actually, when they go to work, they go home in a better state than what they came to work. Because if people didn't have work, well, we can see that now this year with the pandemic, without that social piece, you know, we come from tribes, we like to engage with each other. When that's missing, it really affects our well-being. So actually, by bringing people into work And by giving them some of those secondary health benefits, you know what I mean, in relation to well-being and diet and sleep hygiene and all that all helps, and that can be shared in the family and in the community as well. So we actually help to actually create a healthier society by what we do at work as well, you know. And you could have the negative side of that, whereby if people are not mistreated, but if they suffer at work, the negative impact that can have on family, on their community, and on their society. And that's why, and there's a whole new discussion we can have here on the regulation of this, and why there's a reluctance from a regulator's point to come in and actually say, where's your risk assessment here on psychosocial aspects of work?
Let me just leave with one image that may resonate. It's my impression that you can be working neck deep in shit all day long, but if the person next to you, you trust them and respect them and enjoy their presence, the shit's kind of secondary.
I agree. Yep. And I've had those experiences as well, Fred. I can share some of those stories, like backpacking days in cockroach infested places in Adelaide and stuff, but great memories because the people around you are great. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we need to end here. We're kind of like 5 minutes past here. So, and Greg, Greg, I know you want to get into the wine soon, so you want to do that offline. So I just want to say thanks everybody for joining us. I think the purpose of these Meet the Author sessions is to actually keep them kind of like small, because we can have these really rich sort of conversations here. And just on the chat himself, wow, there's a lot of real cool comments in there. So I'm kind of multitasking, watching the screen, chatting as well. So Tamara, am I correct that all this will be posted soon?
You've got it. So our next one will be the safety view, and that will be on December the 3rd. And Rosa, you're doing a topic on that, aren't you?
Yes, and it is going to be related to what Marion has been talking about so eloquently, the whole mental health piece and how that fits in. And for me, it's an educational process for managers. It has to start there because, you know, knowledge is the first step.
Very good.
Well, thank you, everybody. This has been an amazing conversation. Thank you.
No worries.
Thanks all.
Thanks.
Everyone.
Enjoy the
Till next
birthday
time.
celebrations, Rosa. We'll talk to you again. Bye.
Yeah, and congratulations to you.
Yeah, happy birthday, guys.
Yeah, happy birthday. And Greg, get your drink.
Happy birthday, Weston.
Picking on him.